It was the summer of 1973. Rome was hot. The city was alive. But for one young man, things were about to get very dark. John Paul Getty III was 16 years old. He lived a free life in Rome. He was part of a bohemian crowd. He liked art and music. He dressed how he wanted. He stood out, even in Rome. But he was not just any kid. He was the grandson of J. Paul Getty. That name meant something big. It meant immense wealth. J. Paul Getty was America's richest man, maybe the richest man in the world at the time. He built a huge oil empire. He was a legend, but he was also known for being very careful with his money. Some would say he was stingy, very, very stingy. John Paul Getty III was often called Paul. His father was John Paul Getty. Junior Paul's father was one of J. Paul Getty Sr. He lived in a huge mansion. It was called Sutton Place. He collected art. He had a payphone installed there for guests. That tells you a bit about him. He was rich beyond measure, but he was also famously frugal. He distrusted almost everyone. Paul's father, John Paul Getty Jr., had moved to Rome years before. He lived a wild life for a while. He had married a Dutch actress. Her name was Talitha Pole. They were a famous, glamorous couple in the 60s. They were part of the counterculture, but that marriage ended. Paul's parents, John Paul Getty Jr. and Gail Harris, had divorced earlier. Gail was his mother. She was an American woman. She also lived in Rome. She raised Paul and his siblings. Paul stayed with his mother in Rome after the divorce, but he was pretty independent. He drifted between his mother's apartment and his own place. He hung out with artists and musicians. He was a bit of a rebel. He was bright, but had dropped out of school. He was trying to make a living selling jewelry and art. Sometimes he worked as an extra in movies. He lived on his own in an apartment near the Spanish Steps. He had long hair. He often wore a bandana. He loved the freedom of Rome. He spoke Italian. He seemed like a typical Roman youth at first glance, but the Getty name always followed him. It was a blessing and a curse. It gave him access to a certain kind of life, but it also marked him. People knew who he was. People knew who his grandfather was. The family wealth was huge. But it was not easy to get to. J. Paul Getty Sr. was very careful with his money. He had set up trusts. These trusts made sure the money stayed safe. But it also made it hard for family members to access it. They were rich on paper, but they didn't have cash easily available. This detail is important. It'll come up later. On the night of July 10th, 1973, Paul was out. He was in Piazza Farnese. That's a famous square in Rome. He was out late with friends. He was seen at a bar. He was just living his life. He was doing what teenagers do. He was enjoying the summer night. Then things changed. He was taken. It happened quickly. Witnesses saw it, but they didn't know what they were seeing. They thought it might be a joke. Paul was known for being a bit wild. He sometimes played pranks. He even joked about getting kidnapped for money. He would say it to friends. So when a van pulled up and men grabbed him, some people didn't take it seriously. They thought it was Paul being Paul. They thought he was staging something, but it was no joke. It was very real. Paul was shoved into the van. The van drove off. His friends waited. But he never came back. His mother, Gail, soon realized something was wrong. Paul wasn't answering her calls. He wasn't showing up. This wasn't like him. Not really. She started to worry deeply. The initial confusion gave way to a chilling fear. Her son was gone, and she knew why. The Getty name. The vast, almost unbelievable Getty fortune. It had finally drawn unwanted attention. Someone had decided to take a piece of it. By taking her son. The phone rang in Gail Harris's Rome apartment. It was the kidnappers. The call came just after Paul disappeared. They had him. They wanted money. A lot of money. The demand was clear, $17 million US. Gail's heart must have sunk. $17 million. That was a sum even the richest man in the world might pause at. Gail knew she had to act fast. She called the police. But the Italian police were not very helpful at first. They thought it was a scam. They thought Paul had run away, or that he staged his own kidnapping. This was partly because of Paul's past jokes about it, and because he was a free spirit. The police suspected he just wanted to get money from his rich grandfather. They told Gail to wait. They said he would probably show up. But Gail knew her son. She knew he would not do this. Not like this. She knew he was in real danger. She also knew she had to talk to the one person who could pay. J. Paul Getty Sr., her ex-father-in-law. This was not an easy conversation to have. She knew his reputation. She knew his ways. She called him at Sutton Place. She told him what happened. She told him the ransom demand. J. Paul Getty Sr.'s reaction was firm and shocking. He refused to pay. He said it was a trick. He said Paul had staged it himself. He truly believed his grandson was behind it. His reasoning was cold and calculated. He famously said, "I have 14 grandchildren. If I pay 1 penny, then I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." He believed paying would set a dangerous precedent. It would make all his other grandchildren targets. He was also a very stubborn man. He did not like to be told what to do, especially not by criminals. He saw it as giving in. He saw it as weakness. Gail was devastated. She was talking to the only man with the power to save her son. And he was saying no. He was digging his heels in. This was not just about money for him. It was about principle. It was about control. It was about his distrust of everyone, even his own family. He suspected everyone. He was a lonely man, despite his wealth. The days stretched into weeks. Paul was still missing. The police were still not doing much. They continued to believe it was a hoax. They thought Paul was hiding out somewhere. This lack of action put immense pressure on Gail. She was alone in Rome, her son was gone, and the richest man in the world would not help. She pleaded with John Paul Getty Sr. She tried to convince him that Paul was truly in danger. She sent him letters. She made more phone calls. But he would not budge. He stayed firm in his belief. He had money, but he would not release it. He would not give in to what he saw as blackmail. The kidnappers were also getting impatient. They had taken a young man. They expected a quick payout. They had targeted the grandson of a billionaire. They thought it would be easy money. But they were wrong. They ran into the immovable wall of John Paul Getty Sr.'s will. They started making threats. They called Gail. They said they would hurt Paul. They said they would send her proof. Proof that this was real. Proof that they meant business. Gail lived in constant fear. Every phone call, every knocked door was terrifying. She didn't know if she would hear good news or the worst news. The situation was getting more and more desperate. The news of the kidnapping started to spread. The media picked up on it. The story of the missing grandson of the world's richest man was too big to ignore. It was a shocking contrast, immense wealth on one side, and a missing boy in danger on the other. And the rich man refusing to pay. This captivated the world. But it did not move John Paul Getty Sr. not yet. The kidnappers knew they had to do something drastic. They had to show they were serious. They had to break through Getty Sr.'s stubbornness. They had to make him believe. The weeks turned into months. Paul was still missing. It was now November. 4 months had passed since he was taken. The kidnappers were frustrated. They had not received a single penny. They knew John Paul Getty Sr. was the problem. They knew he didn't believe them. They needed to send a message. A very clear message. A brutal one. A package arrived at a newspaper office in Rome. It was addressed to the paper. Inside, there was a lock of hair. And something else, something horrific, a human ear. It was carefully wrapped. With the package, there was a note. The note said it was Paul's ear. It said they would send him back in pieces if the ransom wasn't paid, and it said they were serious. It had taken a long time for the ear to arrive. It was badly preserved. This led to a delay in delivery. The newspaper published the story. The photos of the package, the ear. It was shocking. The world reacted with horror. This was no longer a suspected prank. This was real. Very, very real. No one could deny it now. Gail Harris, Paul's mother, had to identify the ear. It was a mother's worst nightmare. She looked at it. She knew it was her son's. It was a traumatic moment. She was beyond grief. She was terrified for what might come next. The package also contained a letter from Paul himself. He wrote in it. He begged his family to pay. He said he was being held in a cave. He was cold. He was hungry. He was scared. He said he just wanted to come home. This letter, combined with the ear, was undeniable proof. Now, John Paul Getty Sr. could no longer pretend it was a hoax. The proof was too strong. The public pressure was also immense. News outlets around the world covered the story. People were outraged. How could the richest man in the world let this happen? How could he let his grandson be tortured? But even then, John Paul Getty Sr. was still difficult. He was deeply affected by the ear. He was shaken, but he still struggled to open his wallet. His initial reaction was to bargain. He sent negotiators to Italy, but they were to negotiate the price down, not just pay it. The original demand was $17 million. After the ear was sent, the kidnappers lowered it. They lowered it to about $3 million. This showed they were also desperate. They wanted to get rid of Paul. They wanted their money. They had misjudged the Getty family. The negotiations were long and drawn out. They were complex. Gail was in the middle of it all. She was trying to manage the kidnappers. She was trying to manage her ex-father-in-law. She was fighting for her son's life. It was a terrible burden. Paul's father, John Paul Getty Jr., was also involved. But he was struggling himself. He had battles with addiction. He was not as strong a force as Gale. He wanted to help, but he did not have the power or the resources of his father. And J. Paul Getty Sr. finally agreed to pay, but there was a condition, a very, very strict condition. He would only pay about $2,900,000, and of that he would only give $2,200,000 as a gift. The remaining $700,000, which was the maximum amount that was tax deductible, he would loan to his son, Paul's father. This loan would have to be paid back. With 4% interest, this was vintage Getty Sr. Even in the face of his grandson's torture, he was thinking about taxes. He was thinking about interest. He was thinking about his principles of not giving away money easily. It showed his deep-seated beliefs about wealth, and it showed his cold calculation. It was hard for the rest of the world to understand, but for him, it made perfect sense. It was how he had built his empire. The family had to scramble to put the money together. It was a complex process. There were legal documents to sign. Agreements had to be made. It took more time, precious time that Paul was spending in the hands of his captors. Every day was a risk. Every day was torture. The fear was that the kidnappers would get impatient again. They might send another piece of him, or worse, but the agreement was made. The money was finally coming. The ordeal was almost over. Paul was so close to freedom. The ransom was finally agreed upon. It was a lower sum than the kidnappers first demanded, and it came with strings attached from J. Paul Getty Sr., but the money was ready. The focus now shifted to the actual exchange. This part was dangerous and had to be done carefully. The kidnappers were armed. They were criminals. The family had secured the money. It was a mix of US dollars and Italian lira. The actual delivery involved a complex plan. It needed to be done in a remote area, away from police, away from the public. The Italian police were involved in the background. But they had to be careful not to spook the kidnappers. Paul's mother, Gale, was directly involved in the process. She was brave. She worked with the negotiators. She did everything she could to ensure her son's safe return. The location for the drop was chosen. It was a lonely stretch of highway in southern Italy. Calabria. This was known as a stronghold of the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian Mafia. They were the ones believed to be behind the kidnapping. They were a ruthless organization. The money was delivered. It was dropped off at the designated spot. The family waited. Everyone held their breath. Would Paul be released? Would the kidnappers honor their word? After so many months of agony, the tension was immense. And then on December 15th, 1973, news came. But Paul was found. He was found alive. He was discovered by a truck driver on a highway. Also in southern Italy. He was found near a service station. It was almost exactly 5 months after he was kidnapped. Paul was disoriented. He was very thin. He was visibly traumatized. He was dirty. His hair was long and matted, and he was missing his right ear. The wound was still healing. He was a shell of the young man who had been taken, but he was alive. That was the most important thing. He was quickly taken to a hospital. His mother, Gale, rushed to his side. It was an emotional reunion. She had fought tirelessly for him, and now he was finally back. But the joy was mixed with deep sadness and fear for his future. She saw the damage that had been done. The immediate medical attention focused on his physical wounds. The missing ear was a major issue. He would need reconstructive surgery, but his physical wounds were only part of the story. The psychological wounds were deep. Paul had endured months of captivity. He had been beaten. He had been threatened. He had been deprived of food and light. He had been kept in isolation. He had been subjected to the mutilation of his ear. These things leave lasting scars. And he talked about what happened. He described being moved around, being kept in a cave, being tied up. He talked about the men who held him. He was a prisoner for 150 days. It was a terrifying experience for a 16-year-old boy. The police tried to track down the kidnappers immediately after his release. While some members of the 'Ndrangheta were eventually arrested, some were convicted, but not all. Many of them escaped justice. The vast criminal network made it hard to catch everyone involved, and much of the ransom money was never recovered. The mafia had gotten away with it. For the most part, Paul's release was a moment of relief, but it was not an end to the story. It was just the beginning of a very long and difficult journey for him, a journey of recovery, a journey that would impact the rest of his life. The kidnapping changed him forever, and it changed his family too. It exposed the cold heart of immense wealth and the brutal reality of human greed. Paul's life after the kidnapping was incredibly difficult. He returned to Rome, but he was not the same free-spirited teenager. He had been deeply traumatized. The physical wounds were clear. He had to undergo multiple surgeries to try and rebuild his ear. The doctors tried their best, but it was never fully restored. The mental scars were even deeper. He struggled with what he had been through. He had nightmares, he had anxiety, he had trouble sleeping. He carried the weight of those months of captivity with him every day. He tried to find a new normal. He tried to pick up his life. He even married and had a child, a son named Balthazar. He attempted to work in film, following in some of his family's footsteps, but the trauma never left him. He turned to drugs and alcohol to cope with his pain. This was a common path for people who suffer such severe trauma. His addiction grew. It became another struggle in his life. The wealth that had put him in danger now offered little comfort. It could not heal his mind. In 1981, just 8 years after his kidnapping, Paul suffered a massive stroke. He was only 25 years old. The stroke was likely brought on by his drug use. It left him severely disabled. He was left partially blind. He was quadriplegic. He could not speak properly. He needed round-the-clock care for the rest of his life. He lived for many more years, but his life was confined. He was cared for by his mother, Gail, for a long time. She remained devoted to him. She made sure he had the best care possible. Paul Getty III died in 2011. He was 54 years old. He lived almost 40 years after his kidnapping, but those years were marked by suffering. The kidnappers faced some justice. As mentioned, Italian police arrested several people. Some were identified as members of the 'Ndrangheta. 2 of the kidnappers were convicted and sent to prison. Others were never caught. The majority of the ransom money was never found. It likely flowed into the coffers of the Calabrian mafia. John Paul Getty Sr. died in 1976, just 3 years after the kidnapping. He was 83. He never expressed public regret for his actions or for his delay in paying the ransom. He remained consistent in his views about money. His legacy became tied to this event. He was remembered as the richest man who refused to pay for his grandson's freedom. His name became synonymous with extreme wealth and extreme parsimony. The kidnapping had a profound impact on the entire Getty family. It exposed the dark side of immense wealth. It showed that money does not buy happiness. And it certainly does not buy safety. The family remained fractured. The event cast a long shadow over them. And the story of John Paul Getty III's kidnapping has been told many times. It has been the subject of books, documentaries, and major films. It continues to fascinate people. It is a cautionary tale. It shows the devastating human cost when wealth becomes more important than human life. It shows how one man's choices can lead to a lifetime of pain for another. Paul's life was stolen from him at a young age. He never truly recovered the carefree spirit he had before July 10th, 1973. His story is a stark reminder that even the most privileged lives can be shattered by tragedy, and that sometimes the greatest wealth can come with the greatest burdens.